The Awakening, Chapter 17. The Pontellier possessed a very charming home on an Esplanade street in New Orleans. It was a large, double cottage with a broad front veranda, whose round, fluted columns supported the sloping roof. The house was painted a dazzling white. The outside shutters, or jalousies, were green. In the yard, which was kept scrupulously neat, were flowers and plants of every description which flourish in South Louisiana. Within doors the appointments were perfect after the conventional type. The softest carpets and rugs covered the floors. Rich and tasteful draperies hung at doors and windows. There were paintings, selected with judgment and discrimination, upon the walls. The cut glass, the silver, the heavy damask, which daily appeared upon the table were envy of many women whose husbands were less generous than Mr. Pontellier. Mr. Pontellier was very fond of walking about his house, examining its various appointments and details, to see that nothing was amiss. He greatly valued his possessions, chiefly because they were his, and derived genuine pleasure from contemplating a painting, a statue, a rare lace curtain, no matter what, after he had bought it and placed it among his household goods. On Tuesday afternoons, Tuesday being Mrs. Pontellier's reception day, there was a constant stream of callers, women who came in carriages or in the street cars, or walked when the air was soft and distance permitted. A light-coloured mulatto boy, in dress coat and bearing a diminutive silver tray for the reception of cards, admitted them. A maid in white fluted cap offered the callers liqueur, coffee, or chocolate, as they might desire. Mrs. Pontellier, attired in a handsome reception gown, remained in the drawing-room the entire afternoon receiving her visitors. Men sometimes called in the evening with their wives. This had been the programme which Mrs. Pontellier had religiously followed since her marriage, 6 years before. Certain evenings during the week she and her husband attended the opera or sometimes the play. Mr. Pontellier left his home in the mornings between 9 and 10 o'clock, and rarely returned before half-past 6 or 7 in the evening, dinner being served at half-past 7. He and his wife seated themselves at the table one Tuesday evening, a few weeks after their return from Grand Isle. They were alone together. The boys were being put to bed. The patter of their bare, escaping feet would be heard occasionally, as well as the pursuing voice of the quadroon, lifted in mild protest and entreaty. Mrs. Pontellier did not wear her usual Tuesday reception gown. She was in an ordinary house dress. Mr. Pontellier, who was observant about such things, noticed it, as he served the soup and handed it to the boy in waiting. "Tired out, Edna? Whom did you have? Many callers?" he asked. He tasted his soup and began to season it with pepper, salt, vinegar, mustard, everything within reach. "There were a good many," replied Edna, who was eating her soup with evident satisfaction. "I found their cards when I got home. I was out." "Out!" exclaimed her husband, with something like genuine consternation in his voice, and he laid down the vinegar cruse and looked at her through his glasses. "Why? What could have taken you out on Tuesday? What did you have to do?" "Nothing. I simply felt like going out, and I went out." "Well, I hope you've left some suitable excuse," said her husband, somewhat appeased, as he added a dash of cayenne pepper to her soup. "No, I left no excuse. I told Joe to say I was out, that was all." Why, my dear, I should think you'd understand by this time that people don't do such things. We've gotta observe less consequences if we ever expect to get on and keep up with the procession. If you felt that you had to leave home this afternoon, you should have left some suitable explanation for your absence. This soup is really impossible. It's strange that woman hasn't learned yet to make a decent soup. Any free lunch stand in town serves a better one. Was Mrs. Belthrop here? Bring the tray with the cards, Joe. I don't remember who was here. The boy retired and returned after a moment, bringing the tiny silver tray, which was covered with ladies' visiting cards. He handed it to Mrs. Pontellier. "Give it to Mr. Pontellier," she said. Joe offered the tray to Mr. Pontellier and removed the soup. Mr. Pontellier scanned the names of his wife's callers, reading some of them aloud, with comments as he read. "The Misses de la Cides, I worked a big deal in futures for their father this morning. Nice girls. It's time they were getting married. Mrs. Belthrop, I tell you what it is, Edna, you can't afford to snub Mrs. Belthrop. Why, Belthrop could buy and sell us 10 times over. His business is worth a good round sum to me. You'd better write her a note. Mrs. James Highcamp. Huh. The less you have to do with Mrs. Highcamp, the better. Madame Lafroche came all the way from Carrollton too. Poor old soul. Miss Wings, Eleanor Bolton's." He pushed the cards aside. "Mercy!" exclaimed Edna, who had been fumming. "Why are you taking the thing so seriously and making such a fuss over it?" "I'm not making any fuss over it, but it's just such seeming trifles that we've got to take seriously. Such things count." The fish was scorched. Mr. Pontellier would not touch it. Edna said she did not mind a little scorched taste. The roast was in some way not to his fancy, and he did not like the manner in which the vegetables were served. "It seems to me," he said, "we've spent money enough in this house to procure at least one meal a day which a man could eat and retain his self-respect." "You used to think the cook was a treasure," returned Edna indifferently. "Perhaps she was when she perhaps she was when she first came, but cooks are only humans. They need looking after, like any other class of persons that you employ. Suppose I didn't look after the clerks in my office. Just let them running things their own way. They'd soon make a nice mess of me and my business." "Where are you going?" asked Edna, seeing that her husband arose from table without having eaten a morsel except a taste of the highly seasoned soup. "I'm going to get my dinner at the club. Good night." He went into the hall, took his hat and stick from the stand, and left the house. She was somewhat familiar with such scenes. They had often made her very unhappy. On a few previous occasions she had been completely deprived of any desire to finish her dinner. Sometimes she had gone into the kitchen to administer a tardy rebuke to the cook. Once she went to her room and studied the cookbook during an entire evening, finally writing out a menu for the week, which left her harassed with a feeling that after all she had accomplished no good that was worth the name. But that evening Edna finished her dinner alone, with forced deliberation. Her face was flushed and her eyes flamed with some inward fire that lighted them. After finishing her dinner she went to her room, having instructed the boy to tell any other callers that she was indisposed. It was a large, beautiful room, and picturesque in the soft dim light which the maid had turned slow. She went and stood at an open window and looked up upon the deep tangle of the garden below. All the mystery and witchery of the night seemed to have gathered there amid the perfumes and the dusky and tortuous outlines of flowers and foliage.